I didn't cry that night. I remember that clearly. I sat in the small bedroom at the back of my son's house, the one that used to be a storage room before they cleared it out to make space for me, and I opened my laptop in the dark. The screen light was the only thing in that room that felt like it belonged to me. I had just heard everything. My daughter-in-law didn't know I was home. I had come back early from my cardiologist appointment at St. Michael's Hospital because the waiting room was backed up and they'd asked me to reschedule. I walked in through the side door the way I always did, took off my boots quietly in the mudroom, and that's when I heard her voice. Sharp, certain, coming from the kitchen. "She's sick, Trevor. She's going to get worse. I don't want our kids watching someone deteriorate in this house. I don't want that to be their childhood." There was a pause. I stood completely still. "She's my mother," my son said. "She's not my responsibility." Her voice didn't waver. "Give her until the end of the month. That's fair. That's more than fair." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Trevor said. "I'll talk to her." I stood in that mudroom for what felt like a long time. The floor was cold through my socks. I could hear the television from the living room where my grandchildren were watching something, some cartoon with bright colors and loud music. I could smell dinner on the stove. Everything was completely normal, except for the fact that my son had just agreed to make me leave. I didn't gaze into the kitchen. I went to my room, sat down on the edge of the bed, opened my laptop, and started looking at apartments. My name is Adele. I'm 67 years old. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, and I have spent most of my adult life either working, raising my children, or trying very hard not to be a burden to anyone. That last one, I think, was always my biggest mistake. I moved into Trevor and his wife Nadine's house in Mississauga 14 months before that night in the mudroom. My cardiologist had found a blockage. Not critical, he said, but serious enough that living alone in my apartment on the 14th floor wasn't ideal. The elevator had been unreliable for years. I had no one else locally. My daughter Cynthia had moved to Vancouver a decade ago, and my husband passed in 2019. Trevor suggested I come stay with them while we figured out next steps. Nadine had agreed, or so Trevor told me. Looking back, I think she agreed to the idea of it, not to me. I tried to be invisible. I cooked when I could. I watched the grandchildren on Wednesdays when Nadine had her fitness classes. I stayed out of the main parts of the house in the evenings. I asked before I used the washing machine. I paid Trevor $400 a month, his idea, not mine, but I insisted on contributing something. I felt the arrangement like a weight I was constantly adjusting, always aware of it, always making sure it didn't tip. Nadine was polite to me the way a hotel front desk clerk is polite, efficient. Correct? No warmth behind it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself she just needed time. 14 months. I never stopped feeling like a guest who had overstayed. The next morning, Trevor knocked on my door before he left for work. He had his jacket on already, his coffee in his hand, and the look on his face told me he'd been rehearsing what to say. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" "I already know," I said. He looked startled, then relieved. That quick exhale of a man who didn't have to do the difficult thing after all? That was what hurt the most. Not the words, the relief. He said he was sorry. He said it wasn't what he wanted. He said Nadine had concerns about the kids, about stress in the house, about the long term. He said maybe we could look at some nice places, that there were good retirement communities, that he'd help me with the costs. He said a lot of things that added up to I chose her. I nodded through all of it. I said I understood. I said I'd start looking. After he left, I sat down with my second cup of tea and I thought about my own mother. She had lived with us for 6 years before she passed in the back bedroom of our house in Thunder Bay. Trevor was 12 when she died. He'd adored her, used to fall asleep watching hockey with her on Friday nights. I wondered when he forgot that. Then I stopped wondering about it and got back to my laptop. What Nadine didn't know, what Trevor may have forgotten, or perhaps never thought to mention, was that I was not without resources. When my husband Harold passed, he left behind a modest but carefully managed estate. We had bought a small rental property on Baxter Street in Hamilton back in 2003 on the advice of Harold's brother who worked in real estate. We'd almost sold it twice when money got tight, but we never did. By 2024, that property had appreciated considerably. I also had Harold's life insurance, a defined benefit pension from my 31 years working as a school board administrator, and my own RRSP, which I had been converting steadily to a RIF. I was not rich, but I was not someone who needed to sleep in a back bedroom that smelled faintly of old cardboard. I had simply chosen, for some reason I was still working out, to shrink myself down to the size of a problem that needed solving. The night I heard Nadine in the kitchen, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not with anger, exactly. Something quieter. I made a decision, sitting in the blue light of my laptop, that I was going to stop making myself small. I started with the apartments. I found a 2-bedroom unit in a mid-rise building in Oakville, not far from the lake. 10th floor. Hardwood floors. Good light in the morning, the listing said. And when I went to see it that Thursday, alone, I didn't tell Trevor. I stood at the window and looked out at the water and felt something I hadn't felt in 14 months. Like I could breathe normally. I put down first and last on the spot, $3,200 a month, which I could manage comfortably. I asked for possession in 3 weeks. Then I called my lawyer. I had made Trevor the primary beneficiary of my estate when Harold passed. It had felt like the right thing at the time. He was local, he was steady. Cynthia was all the way in Vancouver and had her own complicated life. I hadn't revisited it. I asked my lawyer, a woman named Elspeth, who I had worked with since Harold's death, and trusted completely, to update my will. I made Cynthia and my 2 grandchildren, Trevor's kids, ironically, equal beneficiaries. The rental property in Hamilton I put into a separate trust for the grandchildren's education. Trevor and Nadine would receive nothing directly. Elspeth didn't ask me why. She'd been doing estate law for 30 years. I imagined she'd heard everything. I also called my financial advisor and moved my RIF withdrawals to a separate account that Trevor had no visibility into. He'd been loosely aware of my finances for years in the way that adult children sometimes are, not managing anything but knowing the general shape of things. I preferred he not have that anymore. I didn't table in Mississauga with a cup of tea that. The weeks that followed were strangely peaceful. I continued my routines. I made Didon on Tuesdays. I watched the grandchildren on Wednesdays. I stayed out of the main areas in the evenings. But something had changed inside the routines. I was doing them because I chose to, not because I was trying to maintain a fragile arrangement. There's a difference. I had never noticed how much of what I did was fear-based until the fear went away. Trevor, to his credit, seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what he'd set in motion. He lingered in the kitchen some mornings, clearly wanting to say something, then leaving without saying it. Once he started to say, "Mom, about the apartment search," and I told him I'd found a lovely place in Oakville and was moving in 3 weeks. He looked surprised. Then that relief again. "Nadine, who had been noticeably warmer since the conversation in the kitchen, the warmth of someone who has gotten what she wanted, said that sounded wonderful and asked if I needed help packing. I said I was fine. I should explain about Cynthia. My daughter and I had a difficult period in her 30s. She made choices I didn't understand. She felt I was critical of her life, and there were years where we barely spoke. I won't put all the fault on her or all of it on me. We were both stubborn and both hurt, and we let too much time pass the way you do when you're waiting for the other person to go first. When Harold died, she came home for the funeral, and we spent 4 days together that were more honest than anything we'd said in a decade. She went back to Vancouver and we started talking on the phone again, slowly, carefully, like people who had broken something and were checking to see if it could hold weight. By the time I moved into Trevor's house, Cynthia and I were speaking every Sunday. By the time I heard Nadine in the kitchen, she was the first person I called. "Get out," she said, before I'd even finished telling her what happened. "Get out and don't look back." She flew in from Vancouver the weekend I moved into the Oakville apartment. She slept on my inflatable mattress while I had the actual bed I bought. A proper queen bed, the most expensive single purchase I'd made for myself in years. And we stayed up until 2 in the morning eating takeout and talking. She helped me hang pictures. She came with me to IKEA and pushed the cart and made me laugh at the Swedish names until my stomach hurt. She asked me why I hadn't told her how bad it had gotten. I didn't have a good answer. I think I was ashamed. I think I had convinced myself that needing help was the same thing as being a burden, and I had applied that to everyone, not just Trevor. I had been protecting myself from asking for things by deciding in advance that I had no right to ask. It's a peculiar kind of loneliness that. 3 months after I moved into the Oakville apartment, Trevor called me. I had seen him twice since the move, once for his son's birthday, which I attended and at which Nadine was cordial, and once for a brief coffee. We were finding a new shape for our relationship, something smaller and more careful than what we'd had. I was trying to be patient with it. When he called that evening, his voice was different, tighter. He said there was something he needed to tell me, that things had been hard, that Nadine and he had been having some problems. He didn't get specific at first, said only that there were financial pressures he hadn't shared with me, that he'd been dealing with something for a while, and it had gotten worse. I asked him to just tell me. He had invested a significant amount of money from their home equity line of credit, which they had opened the year before, he told me, without telling Nadine the full extent of it, into a private business venture that had failed. He'd lost nearly $90,000. Nadine had found out 4 months ago. They were now in a financial position that required them to either refinance their mortgage at a significantly higher rate or sell the house. He was quiet for a moment after telling me all of this. Then he said, "I thought maybe if you had anything you could spare." "Trevor," I said, "even alone, just to bridge." "Trevor," I said it more gently the second time, "I love you, but I'm not going to do that." There was a long silence. "I understand," he said finally. "I hope you do," I said. "I really hope you do." We said goodbye. I sat for a while in my living room with the lights off, looking at the city lights below me. I thought about Harold, about what he would have said. Harold had a way of cutting through things. He would have said something like, "You didn't cause this, and it's not yours to fix." He was usually right about things like that. What happened in the months after that, I'll tell you honestly, was not dramatic. There was no grand confrontation. Nadine did not call me weeping to apologize. Trevor did not show up at my door having had some profound realization. What happened was slower and in its own way more satisfying. Trevor and Nadine listed the house. They downsized to a townhouse in Hamilton, closer to his work, which meant the grandchildren changed schools. It was hard for them, from what Trevor told me. Nadine got a full-time job for the first time in 8 years. Trevor started counseling. He mentioned this once, almost in passing, in a way that told me it was significant to him even if he didn't want to make it so. And Trevor started calling more, not to ask for things, just to talk. He called on my birthday and stayed on the phone for over an hour. He called when his son had a hockey tournament and wanted to tell me about the goals. He called once at 9 on a Tuesday night just to ask how I was doing and actually wait for the answer. I didn't bring up what had happened. I didn't need to. I think he was trying to be a son again. I think the life he'd been living, the nice house, the particular version of success he and Nadine had constructed together, had required him to become someone smaller inside it. I'm not making excuses for him. I'm just trying to understand it, the way I've tried to understand most things about my children. My apartment in Oakville, as it turned out, suited me exactly. I joined a book club at the library that met on alternate Thursdays. I started going to a gentle yoga class at the community center. I made a friend, a woman named Octavia who lived on the 8th floor and whose husband had passed the previous spring, and we started walking along the lake path on weekend mornings and going for breakfast afterward. She made me laugh in the way that women of a certain age can make each other laugh. At the particular indignities of getting older, at the things we'd tolerated for too long, at the unexpected freedoms that came with no longer caring quite so much what people thought. My health had improved somewhat. The cardiologist adjusted my medication and said the new blood work was encouraging. I slept better. I cooked what I wanted to eat and ate it when I was hungry. I read late into the night sometimes when I couldn't sleep, lying in my proper bed with a proper lamp and a cup of tea. And I thought, this is mine. This small lamplit thing is mine. In the spring, Cynthia came back for 2 weeks. We drove up to Owen Sound and spent a weekend at a bed and breakfast and walked on the escarpment and talked the way we'd learned to talk. Honestly, without performance, she told me things about her life I hadn't known. I told her things about Harold, about our early years, that I'd never told anyone. We cried a little and laughed more. On the drive back, she said, "I'm glad you left, Mum. I know that sounds terrible." "It doesn't," I said. "I'm glad too. There's something I want to say, and I'm not sure I'll say it perfectly, but I'll try." I spent a long time believing that the measure of a good mother was how little you asked for. That love meant absorbing things quietly, their stress, their dismissal, their convenience, and never pointing out the cost. I was so afraid of being difficult, of being too much, of being the elderly woman who made everyone else's life harder, that I chose a back bedroom over my own dignity for 14 months. What I learned in that Oakville apartment with its morning light and its view of the lake was that the version of love I had been practicing was not really love. It was fear dressed up as generosity, and it had taught my son, without my meaning to, that I had no needs worth protecting, that I would absorb anything, that I could be managed rather than loved. I don't blame Trevor entirely. I taught him part of it. But I stopped teaching that lesson the night I sat in the dark with my laptop and started looking at apartments, and slowly, uncertainly, something else started growing between us, something that had more truth in it, that had more of me in it, and that was, I think, closer to what I had always actually wanted. He came for Thanksgiving that year, just him, not Nadine. They were still working things out, some weeks better than others. He brought his son and daughter, and we cooked together in my kitchen, all 4 of us. And my grandson accidentally dropped a bowl of cranberry sauce on the floor and looked at me in absolute terror, and I laughed until I had to sit down. "It's okay," I told him. "We'll just make more." And we did, and it was fine. And that, the kitchen with cranberry sauce on the floor and my grandchildren laughing nervously and my son standing at my stove in my home, a guest in my life instead of the other way around, that was the moment I knew I had finally gotten something right. I keep thinking about that mudroom floor, how cold it was through my socks, how I stood there listening to my son agree to something I never thought he was capable of agreeing to, and how I felt, not shattered exactly, but hollowed out, like something had been confirmed that I'd been quietly afraid of for a long time. What I've come to understand, looking back at everything that happened, the months in that back bedroom, the night with my laptop, the apartment in Oakville, the phone call from Trevor about the money he'd lost, is that nothing that happened to any of us was random. Nadine treated me as disposable because I had spent years behaving as though I was. I had made myself so small, so careful, so perpetually apologetic for existing in their space that I had essentially taught the people around me that my presence had no real weight. That is not someone else's cruelty. That is something I participated in slowly, one Tuesday dinner and one quiet evening and one $400 monthly payment at a time. The moment I stopped doing that, the moment I opened that laptop and started looking at apartments without asking permission, called Elspeth and updated my will without announcing it, put my first and last down on that Oakville unit alone, something in the whole arrangement shifted, not because I had done anything dramatic, because I had simply decided to act like someone whose choices mattered. And the strange thing about that is how quickly the people around you begin to treat you differently when you believe it yourself first. Trevor lost nearly $90,000 because he had, for years, been making decisions from a place of fear and pride, mixed together, too afraid to tell Nadine the truth, too proud to ask for help before things became a crisis. That cost him. It cost his family. And I think he knew, somewhere in the conversation when he asked if I had anything to spare and I said no, that he was living the consequences of choices he'd made, not just financially, but in the kind of son he had been. Nobody handed him that reckoning. He arrived at it himself. What I learned and what I want anyone listening to this to hold on to is something I wish someone had told me when I was younger and still trying so hard to be needed without ever asking to be valued. Integrity? Real integrity? The kind that means you treat yourself with the same honesty you try to extend to everyone else, is not a luxury you earn once things are going well. It's what you fall back on when they aren't. I had integrity in my work for 31 years. I had it in my marriage to Harold. I had lost it somewhere in the act of becoming a mother, where I confused self-erasure with love. And resilience. Getting up, looking at apartments, driving alone to Oakville to stand at a window and feel the lake air. That's not a personality trait some people have and others don't. It's a decision. It's the decision to keep going past the point where you're sure nothing good is waiting. Cynthia flew in and slept on an inflatable mattress and pushed a cart with me through IKEA and made me laugh until my stomach hurt. That happened because I had made room for it to happen. The cranberry sauce on the floor at Thanksgiving happened because I had made room for that too. I made room by leaving. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself, and maybe even for the people who hurt you, is to simply stop making yourself smaller than you are.